The lake was calm that morning, and the sun reflected off the water like glass. I had just stepped onto my dock with a cup of coffee in hand, enjoying the peace that came with owning a quiet cabin by the water. The dock was my favorite spot, a place where I could fish, relax, or simply watch the world slow down. I had barely settled into my chair when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path behind me. I turned, and there she was, my neighbor Lydia, marching toward me, with that look she always wore when she wanted something. Her sunglasses were perched high on her head, and her lips pressed tight, as though she had already decided I was the problem.
She did not even say hello.
Instead, she pointed at my dock and announced that she would be needing it later that afternoon. Apparently, she was hosting a party at her cabin, and some of her guests wanted to bring boats. Since her property had no dock, she had decided mine would do. I blinked at her for a moment, stunned by the audacity. She did not ask, she demanded. Like my dock was some kind of community property for her convenience. No, Lydia, I said calmly. This dock is on my land, and it is not for your party. Her face twisted in disbelief, as if she had never been told no in her life. She started waving her arms, raising her voice so loud that birds scattered from the trees nearby. She said things like it was selfish of me to keep the dock to myself, and that neighbors should share. She even claimed that since my cabin was not always in use, the dock should be available for others whenever they needed it. I sipped my coffee and let her rant for a while. It was almost amusing to watch how red her face became. Finally, I stood up and walked toward her, my footsteps slow, deliberate. Lydia, I said firmly. This dock was built with my money on my property, and it is not public. If you try to bring your guests here, I will have no choice but to involve the sheriff. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for words, but none came out. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed caught off guard. She sputtered something about me being unreasonable before storming back toward her cabin, muttering under her breath. I sat back down on my chair, heart steady, coffee still warm in my hand. The lake was quiet again, but I knew Lydia was not done. Neighbors like her never let things go that easily. By noon, I noticed unusual activity coming from Lydia's cabin. She was dragging out tables and chairs, setting them up in her yard like she was preparing for a grand festival. Balloons were tied to her porch railing, and a large cooler was already out by the steps. From the sound of it, she had no intention of canceling her plans. I leaned back in my chair and watched silently as cars began pulling up her driveway. People spilled out, carrying trays of food and cases of drinks. Lydia stood at the center of it all, barking directions with her hands on her hips, as if she were the queen of the lake. After a while, I saw her whisper to two men who pointed toward my dock. They laughed, nodded, and started walking down the path that led directly to my property. I set my coffee cup aside and rose slowly from my chair, my eyes never leaving them. When they reached the edge of my dock, I was already standing there, arms crossed. "Gentlemen, this dock is private property," I said evenly. "You are welcome to enjoy the lake from Lydia's cabin, but you will not be tying up boats here." They looked surprised at how firm my voice was. One of them glanced back at Lydia, who was watching from her porch, tapping her foot like she expected her plan to succeed. I could see her already imagining my dock lined with her guests' boats. The men hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in the middle. "Look, we were just told to park the boats here," one of them said, raising his hands. "We did not know it was a problem." "It is a problem," I replied. "This is not community space, and I have already told Lydia she cannot use it." I gestured back toward her cabin, where she now stood fuming. "You should probably go speak with your host before this becomes a bigger issue." The men exchanged looks, then shrugged and started back toward Lydia's place, leaving my dock untouched. I stayed where I was, watching them go, the quiet strength of the lake behind me. But in my gut, I knew Lydia was only getting started. Lydia stormed down her porch steps the moment the men returned to her side. Her voice carried across the water, sharp and shrill, as she berated them for backing down. She pointed toward me, her fingers stabbing the air like a weapon. From where I stood, I could see her lips moving fast, her face turning red as she tried to rile up her guests. A few people looked uneasy, shifting their weight and glancing between her and me. It was clear not everyone was comfortable being dragged into whatever feud she was trying to ignite. But Lydia thrived on drama, and she was not about to stop just because the first attempt had failed. She marched right up to the property, lying hands on her hips. "You think you own this whole lake, don't you?" she shouted. "I told my friends they could dock here, and now you are making me look bad." I stayed calm, letting the silence stretch before answering. "You made yourself look bad, Lydia. I never agreed to share my dock, and I am not going to." Her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she might actually step onto my dock. Instead, she spun on her heel and stomped back toward her guests, announcing loudly that I was a selfish neighbor. The words floated across the water, but I let them slide off me like ripples against the shore. More cars kept arriving, her party growing louder with music and laughter. Still, every so often I noticed her glance my way, her eyes narrowing, as if she were plotting the next move. And each time she did, I straightened in my chair, ready to shut her down again, if she tried. As the afternoon wore on, the lake filled with more noise than it had all summer. Children splashed near Lydia's shoreline, adults lounged with drinks in hand, and music pulsed from a speaker she had dragged outside. From a distance, it looked like any other lively gathering, but beneath the surface, I could feel the tension aimed squarely at me. Lydia strutted among her guests, laughing louder than everyone else, trying to prove she was in control. Yet every few minutes her eyes drifted to my dock. Her gaze was sharp, calculating, like she was waiting for the perfect chance to push her plan again. I kept my place on the dock, fishing rod in hand, though I was not really paying attention to the water. The steady rhythm of the lake calmed me, but my focus remained on her. The way she whispered to certain guests and pointed toward the dock told me she had not let go of her scheme. As the sun began to sink lower, painting the water with streaks of gold, I noticed 2 jet skis appear near her side of the shore. They were ridden by younger men, clearly part of her party. They zipped across the water, recklessly spraying waves as they circled closer and closer to my property line. When they slowed near my dock, I rose from my chair again. I did not shout. I did not wave my arms. Instead, I stood tall, hands at my sides, and waited for them to notice me. The riders pulled their jet skis to a stop, the engines humming as they looked at me. Behind them, Lydia was clapping and cheering as if daring me to react. It was clear she had sent them over to test my resolve. The water lapped softly at the edge of the dock as the standoff stretched in silence. The riders hesitated, unsure whether to push forward or turn back. All the while, Lydia's voice carried across the lake, her laughter sharp and mocking. One of the riders finally called out over the hum of the jet ski. "Hey man, we just need a spot to park for a bit." Lydia said it would be fine. I shook my head slowly, my voice calm but steady. "This dock is private property, and I have already told Lydia no. Turn around before this becomes more than a conversation." The 2 men looked at each other, clearly caught between loyalty to their host and the authority in my tone. I could see hesitation in their eyes. They were not eager to push the issue. Behind them, Lydia yelled across the water, her words sharp and insistent, ordering them to tie up anyway. But neither rider moved. One finally shrugged, muttering something to the other, and they revved their engines, pulling away from the dock. The sound of their departure echoed across the lake, leaving Lydia standing on her shoreline, fuming. She stomped her foot on the grass like a child denied a toy. Her guests had started to notice the scene too. Some whispered to each other while others avoided her gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle she was making. I sat back down in my chair and cast my fishing line into the water as if nothing had happened. The quiet act seemed to irritate her more than any words could have. She was losing control of her own party, and she knew it. Lydia retreated toward her cabin, slamming the cooler lid shut with a loud crack. But even as she disappeared inside, I had the sense she was not finished. Neighbors like her rarely walked away when their pride was on the line. The music from Lydia's party kept playing, but the energy had shifted. Her guests were still gathered in groups, talking, laughing, and eating, but the earlier excitement was dimmed by the tension that had hung in the air. Every so often someone would glance toward my dock, then quickly look away, not wanting to be caught in the middle. I stayed put on my chair, letting the sound of the lake settle around me. The water rippled softly against the posts, and the sun inched lower, with a steady glow. It was the kind of calm that reminded me why I loved this place, and why I would not let anyone take it from me. After a while, Lydia emerged from her cabin again. She had changed clothes into something brighter, flashier, like she was determined to shift attention back to herself. Her smile was wide, but her eyes gave her away. They flicked to me, then back to her guests, as she tried to act unbothered. She raised a glass high in the air, making some kind of toast about friendship and neighbors helping neighbors. Her voice carried across the lake again. She used every word like a weapon aimed at me, without ever saying my name. Some of her guests clapped, but the enthusiasm was thinner this time. Others kept eating, quietly choosing not to engage. Even they seemed to realize her obsession with my dock was spoiling the fun. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I had not spoken a word since the jet skis turned back, yet Lydia was unraveling all on her own. She wanted control, but the more she tried, the less power she seemed to hold. The sun slid lower, painting streaks of orange and pink across the lake. And as the evening settled in, I could feel Lydia's frustration rising again, like a storm brewing just out of sight. The storm broke not long after the sky deepened into shades of purple and gold. Lydia gathered a small group of her closest friends near the shoreline, her voice sharp, though she tried to mask it with forced laughter. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough to know she was still plotting. She pointed toward my dock again, her gestures quick and angry, like she was daring anyone to challenge her. One of her friends shook his head and backed away, clearly not interested in being part of whatever she was planning. Another looked over at me, then muttered something that made Lydia scowl. It was obvious she was losing support even among her own guests. Still, she refused to let go. A little later, as lanterns lit up around her yard, I noticed two teenagers inching toward the water, carrying ropes in their hands. They kept glancing back at Lydia, who stood with her arms folded, watching closely. It did not take much to guess what she had told them to do. I set my fishing pole aside and rose to my feet. The teenagers froze halfway down the path when they saw me standing there waiting. The lake was quiet for a moment, only the sound of crickets filling the air. They shifted uneasily, then looked back at Lydia. She waved her arms at them, urging them forward like a commander pushing soldiers into a fight. But neither moved. Finally, one of them muttered something to the other, and they both turned around, trudging back toward the party with slumped shoulders. From across the water, I saw Lydia throw her hands up in frustration. She tried to mask it with a laugh, but the strain was clear. Her perfect party was slipping out of her grasp, and my dock remained untouched. The air grew cooler as night settled over the lake, and the glow from Lydia's lanterns flickered against the dark water. Her party dragged on, but the mood had shifted into something restless. Conversations grew quieter, laughter sounded forced, and more than a few guests began packing up early. I stayed on my dock, steady and calm, letting the sounds of the lake drown out the noise of her gathering. Every so often I could feel her eyes burning into me from across the way. She had built this party up to be some grand display, and yet it was slipping through her fingers with every failed attempt to use what was not hers. At one point, she stormed into her cabin, and when she came back out, she had a phone pressed to her ear. Her voice carried across the still water, though she tried to lower it. The tone was sharp, clipped, filled with frustration. She was calling for backup. It did not take much to guess who she was speaking to. Some of her guests exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recognizing that things were escalating beyond a simple disagreement. A couple even left right then, quietly walking to their cars without saying goodbye. But Lydia stayed rooted by the shore, phone in hand, her eyes locked on my dock, as though daring me to move. I did not budge. I simply folded my arms across my chest and waited, watching as the ripples of her choices began to spread further than she ever expected. It did not take long before the distant sound of tires crunching on gravel reached my ears. Headlights cut through the trees, and a county sheriff truck rolled up near Lydia's cabin. The chatter at her party hushed instantly as every guest turned to watch what would happen next. Lydia hurried toward the vehicle, waving her arms dramatically as if she had just survived some disaster. She pointed in my direction, speaking so fast her words tangled together. Even from across the water, I could hear her voice rising, full of outrage and false victimhood. The deputy stepped out slowly, his hand resting on his belt as he surveyed the scene. He listened to Lydia rant for a while, his expression flat and unreadable. Finally, he raised a hand to quiet her, then turned his gaze toward me. I stood calmly at the edge of my dock, arms at my sides, the still water lapping gently against the wood. The deputy walked down the path toward me, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. When he reached the property line, he stopped and spoke in an even tone. "Evening, sir," he said. "Lydia tells me you are refusing to let her guests use your dock." "That is correct," I replied. "This dock was built on my land. It belongs to me, and I have told her multiple times she cannot use it." The deputy glanced back at Lydia, who was standing a few feet behind him, arms crossed, eyes flashing with triumph, as though she thought victory was already hers. Then he turned back to me and asked the question that would decide everything. "Do you have proof this dock is on your property?" Without a word, I reached into the small weathered folder I kept in my cabin. It held the property survey, the official map, showing the lines of my land stretching all the way into the lake where the dock stood firm. I handed the papers to the deputy, who scanned them carefully under the beam of his flashlight. He nodded slowly, then turned to face Lydia. "Ma'am, this dock is entirely on his property. He is within his rights to deny access to anyone he chooses." The words hit Lydia like a slap. Her mouth fell open, and her face flushed crimson. She sputtered protests about neighbors and fairness and community spirit, but the deputy raised a hand and cut her off. "Enough, ma'am," he said firmly. "This is private property. If you or your guests set foot on that dock again without permission, you'll be trespassing, and I will have to take action." Gasps rippled through the party. Some of Lydia's guests shifted uncomfortably, others avoided her gaze. The deputy handed my papers back, gave me a respectful nod, and returned to his truck. I slipped the folder under my arm and watched as he drove off, the headlights fading into the night. The lake grew quiet again, leaving only the faint murmur of Lydia's guests. One by one her party began to unravel. Cars pulled out of her driveway, and the once boisterous music was turned down low. By midnight, the yard that had been full of laughter and noise was nearly empty. Lydia stood on her porch, arms folded, glaring across the water at me. But there was nothing left for her to say. Her plan had failed, and everyone had seen it. I sat back down on my dock, coffee mug in hand, the cool night air settling around me. The water shimmered under the moonlight, peaceful and steady, just as it had been that morning. The dock was mine, and always would be. And Lydia had finally learned the truth that no demand, no tantrum, and no party would ever change that.